let Melissa introduce the workshop, and then Sheila and I are going to tell you a few words about ourselves and our goals. I just wanted to say that this particular song gives me chills because of this. It's almost like it goes through history and comes to our days, and it's encouraging all of us to live in equity and to live in justice and to overcome challenges and threats. And so that's why I thought of starting our class and our workshop and this collaborative effort that we have and brings us together today in order to talk about what matters to the heart and to the mind. So Melissa's the one who's organizing it, right, with student life, and we are coming together to participate. So I would like to give her the floor, so to speak, to introduce the workshop.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Magdalena. So my name is Melissa Sanchez. I do work in the Student Success Center along with Student Life, Multicultural Affairs. I am a college success coach. And then we also have Karina Castillo, who's another college success coach. And we are in charge of doing student success workshops. So welcome. Is a collaborative effort with faculty and the student affairs side of MCC. So I'm so happy to see over 40 plus. I think this has been our largest crowd. So that's a round of applause for Magda and Sheila. This has been awesome. And I'm super excited to hear about their workshop. They're going to be talking about, well, their title of the workshop is Let's Learn to Build a Supportive, Equitable Community. So you guys are going to be learning a lot about different topics based on like microaggression, addressing some of those issues. So please join the conversation either in the chat or, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, please raise your hand so we can identify that courtesy as well for any of our students who might need some additional accommodations. And then also I'm going to be posting on the chat the attendance form. So if you are here for extra credit, or maybe you are also here for an additional program that you need to receive credit for, please fill out the attendance form that I will be putting on the chat. I don't know if you guys had seen the previous couple messages, but I'll put it again just in case. But otherwise, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you so much, Magda and Sheila.
All right, so I'm going to give this a start simply because in terms of organization, my social psychology class is welcoming all of you, right? We are all welcoming the whole college basically, and each and every one of you to be a part of our class and our discussion. We are starting to discuss about prejudice and discrimination in our class, and what an amazing opportunity we have today to have Mrs. Sheila Wengat-Sawani, and she's bringing the sociology perspective into it. So it's just this amazing mix of, I would say, the group level, the macro level, and then the psychology micro level into an understanding of this topic. And Sheila, I'm going to let Sheila introduce herself. First of all, for those of you who do not know me, I am Magdalena Farc, and I am a social psychologist. I teach in the psychology department here at MCC. I'm one of the full-time instructors. It's always a joy, and I get filled with energy when I'm in front of students and I get to talk about these topics that I'm passionate about. Sheila, please introduce yourself as well and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, thank you so much, Magdalena. I really I'm very excited. We've been planning on this for this opportunity for the last like three and a half months, and we've been so excited. And finally today, we are very happy to have Magdalena, your social psychology class, my social problems class welcomes your class as well. Like Magdalena said, that we are going to be trying to give you a context because our focus is going to be on microaggressions. We are going to look at it from a psychological perspective. That's what Magdalena's specialty is. And also we are going to talk about how it perpetuates existing social inequalities. So how the system kind of feeds into itself, and why is it so difficult? You know, we keep talking about racial systems. Why is it so difficult to get to where we are? Why is it such a slow process? You know, attaining this equality, why is it such a slow process? So we're going to be talking about that. So Magdalena, I'm going to share my screen.
And yes, and before you do, if we can ask everyone, when not speaking, to mute yourself, that would be awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Dr. Fark and I will be today talking about racial microaggressions, primarily. So microaggressions could be based on sex, it could be based on sexuality, or even disabilities, but our focus is going to be primarily racial microaggressions. And we are also going to be focusing on the United States. So the patterns and the processes that we are talking about can be found all over the world, but we are kind of narrowing down to our country. So we are also going to be connecting it to the macro level. And then basically I'm talking about white supremacy. And of course, what are the consequences of these racial microaggressions, and both at a societal level, and Dr. Fark will be talking about it at a psychological level. And we are also going to give you tips and tools to be aware of it and what you can do to bring about changes at a personal level. So before I go into the definition, I would like to share a video about racial microaggressions at a personal level.
Oh, you're so pretty for a black girl. Oh, she has a jewel nose. Oh, your hair would look so good if it was straight. Jews are so cheap. Why are you so cheap? Do you speak good English? How are you an Iraqi Jew? I think the person saying microaggression kind of doesn't really think about it. This person who said it was my friend, and like I was astonished they would like say something like that. You don't want to make a big deal about it, but then it's also like you just said something that offended me, so I feel like I should speak up. Because they're micro, because they're very subtle, they're small, you feel like you don't have a reason to be upset. You're overreacting, and people even can make you feel that way when you bring it up. They're like, oh, you can't take a joke. You're making too big of a deal of this. Why are you overreacting? Don't take it so seriously. It was just a joke. Chill out. Say like, oh no, I actually love black people. I love people of color. Like, they try to just minimize the situation. If someone feels hurt by a microaggression, it shouldn't just be pushed to the side. It definitely has negative impacts and like leads to people disliking who they actually are. Those kinds of subtle offensive comments can build up over time, and they can have like a deep psychological effect, and you know, they can make you feel bad and they can make you doubt yourself. We try to just use jokes to like make things less awkward or like ease social experiences, but it is important because you need to like be aware of what you're saying and like who you're speaking to. Think of what you say and how it can affect the person you're saying it to.
Okay, so as we saw at an interpersonal level, microaggressions can be verbal or even behavioral. Some of them are intentional, but some of them the people may not even be aware of it. And even the people who are at the receiving end for these hostile, negative interactions, they may not even understand what is happening many times. Or if they react, you see people become defensive. So, so it has consequences. It has consequences at both the psychological level, and also it has consequences at a societal level, as it maintains the existing system of hierarchy. So how do we identify these microaggressions? And I want to take you to the taxonomy of microaggressions that was given to us by Sue et al. And his taxonomy and typology is based on the intention of the perpetrator and the awareness of the perpetrator. Now, the first type of microaggression is what is called a microassault. Now, this is a little bit more explicit. This is something similar to old-fashioned racism, and it is intentional. It is meant to hurt and attack individuals. So it communicates certain messages about the inferiority of a race, possibly. So, for example, at the environmental level, placing a noose on somebody, a colleague's door, for example, would be an example of a microassault, or wearing a clan hood, the hood for the clan, or displaying swastika, Nazi swastikas, or it could be also displaying a Confederate flag. So basically, the idea then is to threaten somebody, to intimidate them, to make them feel less. And it's a conscious, deliberate attempt to assail the identity of that group. So it could also be verbal. So using racial epithets, for example, like Japs for Japanese, Chinks for Chinese, using the N-word, all these are examples of verbal attacks. Now, usually when people engage in these micro assaults, there is no ambiguity about the intent of those individuals. And we see people engage in them when there is some kind of a degree of anonymity, like hanging a noose on a colleague's door. Somebody may never know who did that. Or when saying racial jokes, it may be in front of people who are very similar, who have similar ideology as this particular individual. So this is the first one when it comes to the taxonomy. We also have certain microaggressions at possibly an unconscious level. And one example is micro insult. And then micro insult actually is based on stereotypes. So if somebody says you speak good English, what is the message that is given? That you're not American. If you mistake a person of color for being a service worker, again, the message is that you are most probably making assumption that this person is in a lower paying job. A woman clutching her purse when she passes by an individual who is Black or who's Hispanic, kind of going with the stereotype of Blacks and Hispanics being criminals. A taxi cab driver who picks up a white client compared to a person of color, showing that this person is a second-class citizen. Most probably it's based on the assumption that the person of color is going to go into a dangerous neighborhood. So as you can see that what we call the unconscious bias may be playing a role. So the person may not even be aware of what they're doing. The third type of microaggression is called micro-invalidation. Again, this is unconscious, and it's based on certain color-blind ideology. And so if you see people who say, there is only one race, and that is human race, or people who say that everyone can succeed if they only work hard, or Blacks don't work hard enough. So basically what the individual is trying to do is negate or nullify their life experiences and deny that any kind of race hierarchy is affecting their chances to succeed. So the thing about all the three of these microaggressions is that these are all either, even though they're hidden or they may be overt, they're all very offensive to the recipient. So is this all what racism is about? Is it just these events or these microaggressions? That is not real. That's actually, racism is much more and beyond the individual. It is an entire system. And the individual actually has no control directly on the system, because the system is already in place. So it is the collective prejudice of the members of a dominant group, or a group that has power, and it is backed by legal authority. So the structure is actually reinforced because there's an ideology that rationalizes this kind of a hierarchy. So basically, I'm talking about a system of hierarchy where people are being placed based on their racial group in this hierarchy. So how does this come about? So what is the origin of this hierarchy or this structure? So sociologists call this kind of a process social construction of race. So sociologists believe that race is created because of political, social, economic competition. So the group that has power to begin with is able to label other groups, is able to create categories. As an example, when European settlers came to America, we have these different indigenous tribes who are already inhabiting America, who get lumped together as Indians and get labeled as being savages, and then get placed in a social hierarchy. Now, similarly, around the same time, we have servitude, which was actually not racially based. Servitude actually was both blacks and white indentured servants were there. But then what happened eventually was, with slavery, a race-based system of hierarchy develops, and blacks equal slaves. And then you have labels of blacks being not being that intelligent, being very aggressive, being very dangerous. And that kind of justifies. So basically, when labels get attached to groups and categories are created, it justifies their positioning and the placement in a social hierarchy. And I want to give you another example, and that is when Southern and Eastern European immigrants came to the United States. They were labeled as being different, not just because of their physical characteristics, but because of the fact that they were speaking a different language, possibly, or belonging to a different religious group. And then they get categorized and again placed in the social hierarchy. Now, the thing about race and the construction of race is, it is at the whim of the dominant group that people can move into and out of certain categorization. So many of the ethnics who came from Europe, for example, kind of got into the category of being whites later on. Now, in other words, when we are talking about racism as a structure, we are talking about race being very central, the central axis for all social relations. We are talking about opportunities. We are talking about relationships. We are talking about life experiences that are shaped by the race of the individual because of the placement in this particular system of hierarchy. This brings me to what we call white supremacy. Now, whenever we hear of white supremacy, we think it is a group, but it is does not really refer to a group. It is actually an ideology. It is an ideology that describes that the superiority of whites. So the ideal, whiteness is ideal for humanity. Anybody who deviates from whiteness is a deviant and kind of because the norm is white supremacy and the norm is superiority of whites. So in other words, racism is unidirectional. It equals white supremacy. So we have a structure with whites at the top, and then the ideology or the cultural idea that is saying that it's justifying the existence of this particular hierarchy in our society. Now, if you're thinking, how is this maintained? How is this hierarchy maintained? It is through this process of racism. So there are three expressions of racism. The first one is at the institutional level. We're talking about policies and procedures that help maintain this kind of power relations between the dominant and the subordinate group. So in the past, it was more obvious, it was more blatant in the form of Jim Crow laws. But now it may not be that obvious. It's a little bit more hidden. So basically, when we're talking about institutional racism, we are talking about how are white people served, how are they financially resourced, how are they uplifted, how are they validated. On the other hand, how are the people of color excluded, how are they underserved, how are they financially exploited, how are they oppressed, how are they invalidated. So, so when it comes to, when I say it's not that obvious, I'm again talking about some kind of microaggressions at an institutional level, which is in the environment. I'm going to give you a few examples. If the top level administration in a college or in a school, or even the CEO, CFOs and companies, what they call the C-suite, if everybody is white and there is no person of color, then what kind of a message does this send to people of color? Most probably they may feel they're not wanted. They may also feel that even if they try, they may not succeed. So this is an example. So it's not, as you can see, it is not a blatant racist policy, but it is kind of certain things that are going on in the system that is giving certain kinds of messages, right? So the other example I want to give you is in the institution of sports. So we have racial mascots that are found in for different teams, right? As an example, till recently it was the chief Illuminate in Urbana, who was actually a white student who would wear Native American regalia and then kind of participate in certain dances. I mean, so it has its consequences, especially, and Magdalena, of course, can tell you later about how this kind of mascots has a negative impact on the psychology of minority groups, and in this case, Native Americans. Another example of institutional racism, and I want to show you the book that we are reading here at MCC, and it's a Black women's history of the United States. This is a book that we are reading for our Black History Month and Women's History Month. This book is talking about the history of Black women. And in our discussions, we have a study group. So students are participating in this particular book study, as well as instructors and staff. In some of the discussions we have had, we have realized that when we were in college and learning history, we hardly met any Black woman who had contributed to our country. And the thing is, the contributions of many of these people is so immense in building the infrastructure of our country. We could hardly count with our 5 fingers the number of women we had encountered in our history lessons in college. So this is again another example of the hidden curriculum in education, where the contributions of Blacks may not be incorporated into the curriculum. So Other examples are there, like example of redlining, urban renewal, security-based layoffs, etc. So we have a whole bunch of things that are going on at an institutional level that is affecting the opportunities and, in fact, invalidating people of color. So this is actually supported at a cultural level. So we're talking about white supremacy, the beliefs, the values, and norms that kind of support or the superiority of whites. And not only that, we are also talking about the imposition of European cultural heritage, the idea that English is the only language that should be spoken. We are talking about certain positive qualities that are attributed to whites versus negative traits for minorities. And Magdalena is going to talk more about stereotypes. We are also going to be, it also implies ideas of beauty, for example, cultural ideas of beauty and Eurocentric features being the norm in our society. That's what is considered to be beautiful. So all these cultural ideas and values and norms are passed on through the process of socialization, through our family, through our peers, and through media. These messages are given to us constantly at a cultural level. And of course, at the individual level, we were talking about some of these actions that we could be taking, which could be unintentional. So it could be covert or overt. So all these go into maintaining white supremacy in our society. One more aspect to this is, if you remember, I was talking about micro-invalidation, and I said it is related to color blindness. So color blindness is something that we all wish existed in our society, because we all believe in what is called the American creed. So it is an ideal that we should live in a society that is treats everybody equally, and all of us agree with it. We believe in it, we have laws based on that. But to make an assumption that we have already reached there is what color blindness does. So it is a belief that we are now no longer having race-based issues. No longer race is affecting our opportunities. What does this do? So this idea of color blindness actually legitimizes the existing social system, the economic, political inequalities that exist in our society. It ignores totally the inequalities based on race. And we often see the people who are engaging in color blindness, they believe that it is the culture of the group that is the problem. They believe it's the social class that is the problem. So it kind of decouples the historical practices that have kind of brought about the present day inequalities. It totally ignores white privilege. White privilege's advantage that whites have in our society because of the positioning in this particular social hierarchy. And color blindness makes white privilege invisible, because it kind of perpetuates the idea that people are able to come up only if only people could try hard enough, right? We're talking about meritocracy. It's only then that people could kind of come up in, so people believe that they've earned the position that and they've worked for it, and definitely they have worked for it, but the system already has been in place in a manner that the starting point has been different for people who are white. So it has also led to what is called laissez-faire racism. So blacks, if they're not able to come up, it is their own fault. It has nothing to do with the existing hierarchy. So that kind of a feeling comes about when we take a colorblind perspective. I'm going to show you a video of a student. This is from the Whiteness Project, which interviewed youngsters who had their own perspective on race. And I have one of them that I want to show you. And this is just to give you an example of what color blindness means.
I don't see color. I don't see, I do whenever you have to describe somebody or if you ask about their specific culture or ethnicity, but I just don't see differences like that really. I hate racism and everybody hates racism, but I just hate that like everything is made into a racist something now. Like everything has to be made that way. And that's just really frustrating because I feel like a lot of our issues don't really start out as race problems, but they become race problems. Any benefit I've got, it's because it's something I worked hard for. I've never let somebody give me the opportunity of my race or something silly like that dictating me getting or not getting something. Like if I'm going to be benefiting from something, it's because, I either want them to think I have a good personality or like I worked really hard for it or I'm experienced enough for it. So I don't think so. I don't think I've benefited too much from being white. I probably have already said it, but I just think it's really important to just, it sounds so silly, but it's just important to love one another and be accepting of each other. And we're all different. Get over it. That's how we were made, So what are you going to do? Keep tearing each other apart until we just deplete, human existence, or just learn to actually start working together, building together, creating something together, and going up instead of down.
Okay. So this individual, as you can see, is believing that there should be equality, but at the same time, we are seeing that they believe that we are already there. So the problem with color blindness is the fact that it takes race off the table. So take a look at some of the things that are said that kind of is an indicator of color blindness. When I look at you, I don't see color, which is really not possible because that's the first thing that we see when we look at an individual. I don't care if you're pink, purple, or polka dotted. And there's only one human race. And if somebody says Black Lives Matter, the rebuttal, all lives matter, which is true, all lives matter. But when people mention Black Lives Matter, they're kind of showing that this hierarchy has placed Blacks at the lowest level. And of course, don't want to talk about race. I know focusing on race is what divides us. So basically, the call is to take race off the table and not talk about it and move on. And this in itself is a microaggression. So Magdalena, I'm going to stop sharing and please take on and let us know what are the consequences of microaggressions.
Yeah, so when the call is to take it off the table, in all good conscience, we cannot take it all off the table. But what we can do is we can understand more regarding race, regarding sex, regarding orientations of all kinds, regarding disabilities, regarding age. We can understand more. And that's our invitation. And some of these ideas are not comfortable to hear. But I want to tell you something, that in life, it is very valuable to engage with ideas that aren't comfortable, because that is the only way that we grow. And that is the invitation that we have for you today. So what I'm going to do as a psychologist, as a social psychologist, and social psychology somewhere at the intersection of psychology and sociology, where we look at the individual in the social context, is I am going to try to put all of the research, or the main ideas that have to do with research from social psychology that can explain some of the realities that Sheila was talking about. And so I'm going to start sharing the screen with you. And if something isn't working, if you are unable to see parts of what I'm doing or what I'm sharing, by all means, please let me know. And I will do the best. Okay, I've got two screens over here, so it's a bit weird what I'm looking at and what you are looking at. But please let me know, write in chat if something cannot be seen. All right, so here is the invitation that I have for you. The invitation is to look at microaggressions as a form of discrimination and maybe as a symbol of some sort of prejudice, some form of prejudice that we are going to understand, to look at this and understand the nature and the power of prejudice. And the first thing that we should do, again, from more of an individual perspective, is to understand what these concepts mean. And I would like to define for you these three concepts: stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination, which are concepts that define elements that have to do with our thoughts, with our emotions, and with our behavior. So they look at the individual in a holistic manner. So we see stereotypes. Stereotypes are perceptions. They have to do with our thoughts, with our cognitions. They are perceptions or beliefs or expectations that we have about members of a certain group simply because they belong to that particular group. They function like schemas, and some of my students are going to remember that we discussed about schemas, kind of like mental frameworks through which we perceive the world. We put on these glasses of perception, in this case, social perception, and these schemas can affect the way that we behave in an automatic way. And we are going to get to that immediately. So if I say, for instance, what do you think about old people or young people? You know, there's research that shows that when people are primed with words such as old, then they also think slow. It is an example of how stereotypes can come up automatically. White males, what do we think of white males? How about black males? How about working women? How about stay-at-home mom? We even have stereotypes based on location. Think of a New Yorker. What's coming to your mind? Somebody who's always in a rush. Think of a Californian. Somebody who's relaxed and surfing, right? So all of these are examples of stereotypes. Now, stereotypes can be positive or negative, and they aren't prejudice. They aren't prejudice. We are going to look at the sources of prejudice, and we are going to talk more. But stereotypes stream from the fact that we are automatically categorizing people and then coming up with these descriptions. The second element is the element that has to do with attitudes, and emotions get involved in there. And here we are talking about negative emotions. Prejudice is an attitude, but it's always a negative attitude. And it's an attitude towards an individual, but it's based simply on the fact that this particular individual belongs to a certain group. And then we have the element of behavior, and that is discrimination, right? This is unjustified negative behavior towards a group and towards the members of the group. And this unjustified behavior can take many forms. We can talk about racism, we can talk about sexism, ageism, and so on. But today we are focusing on racism. We are focusing on this particular area that has been studied tremendously. Social psychologists and sociologists have looked at it. Social psychologists, more from a quantitative perspective, have looked at the dynamics of discrimination. So what I would like to focus on is this. The idea that prejudice, because it's an attitude, functions very alike the dual attitude system that we, those of us who are in social psychology in chapter 4, when we discussed attitude, we noticed that attitudes function according to a dual system, that we in fact have a dual mind that processes information in two ways. In an effortful and conscious way, imagine these train tracks, right, that run in parallel. One of them is effortful and conscious, and the other one is happening very easily in an automatic way and outside of our awareness. That's system one of thinking, a very efficient system that functions implicitly. So what can we say then about prejudice and about prejudice as an attitude? That it can be explicit or implicit. And explicit prejudice is these negative feelings of which people are aware and they get to be expressed very clearly. If you think of microaggressions, for instance, microassaults are explicit, and the other two are more implicit. But here's what's happening in our society right now. People explicitly support racial equality. That is why they don't feel good when they are told, but equality is not there. Because I support it with all my heart, right, explicitly. We deplore discrimination explicitly. But there's something very interesting that happens at the level of the two-track mind, that level that functions outside of our awareness, that level that functions automatically. And that is the implicit element of these biases, right? And we aren't aware of them. And that's why we have righteous indignation when people are saying, but you do have a bias. I have a bias. I don't like to see myself as biased. But I might find myself being biased in situations that I don't even realize exist. So let me tell you a little bit about the nature of implicit prejudice. And that might answer some of the questions that we have, regarding race and discrimination and how it is still present in society today. So this implicit prejudice has to do with prejudice or stereotypic evaluations that occur outside of people's awareness. And sometimes they are subtle, right? We don't have that explicit in-your-face racism any longer, but we have subtle forms of it. They are called modern racism or aversive racism. And they get to be manifested in behaviors, believe it or not. They get to be manifested in employment discrimination. There's a recent study that shows that for whites, when they are sending resumes over there and they have white sounding names such as John, 1 in 10 receive a callback. But if people who have black sounding names such as Jamal are sending resumes, only 1 in 15 gets called. And I recently, actually, I think it was yesterday, that I read an article in which a gentleman said, in these times of crisis, I have been trying, his name is Jose. I've been trying to find a job and I put out my resume everywhere and I never got a call back. But when I changed my name from Jose to Joe on my resume, I got calls back. It's interesting, it's not comfortable to think this is still a reality in today's world, or favoritism. Sheila talked about taxis, right? Uber and Lyft. Wait times are longer for people whose names sound African-American. They get canceled more. And that's in the Uber. There was a big scandal with Uber about 3 years ago because of this. And traffic stops, the war on drugs, like all of these. To fight against criminality, who gets stopped more? Who gets searched more? Who gets booked more? Who gets into prison more? Who stays more in prison? So these are ways in which subtle racial prejudice can be seen in behaviors. So with automatic racial prejudice, that can become dangerous as well, right? There's a test, it's called the implicit association test. Those of you who are in my social psych class, and maybe in sociology, you're taking it too. That's going to be our next assignment. So we can take a race one or, all kinds of political, IAT, implicit association tests that are measuring reaction times, the ease with which people are combining or making associations in their mind. And then they have to click on certain buttons and reaction time is measured. Reaction time is basically ways in which you measure ease of association. Now, when people are primed with a black face, they are faster in identifying a gun rather than a cell phone in the hands of a black person. That's very interesting, provocative research on the gun bias as well. And another study that I want to point to you has to do with the faces that you are seeing on the screen. This is a study that was conducted and published in 2003 by Hugenberg and Bodenhausen. And what it showed was that higher implicit and not explicit prejudice was associated with people's readiness to perceive anger on Black faces. And if you look over here at these faces, they were asked, and one of the things that the participants were asked was, when is the person who is moving, when is the person, the white person, moving from anger onto a more peaceful face? And then when is the other person, the Black person? Now, everything is similar over here, but the color of the skin, right? The eyes and the mouth are the same in these pictures, but substantially, people perceived that the white person was moving in, on average, where you see E, and the Black person was moving towards not being threatening, where it's N, right? So perceiving it faster. And so it's interesting that this readiness to perceive anger, we would think, well, okay, I mean, this seems to be a study that is just seen, I don't know, in journals. Does it have any impact on real life? And there's an amazing book written by Claude Steele. It's called Whistling Vivaldi. And the name of the book comes from an experience that a graduate student in psychology from University of Chicago, which is one of the top universities in the US, while he was a graduate student, he had a very interesting experience. And I actually want to read his words because they are very, very powerful. His name is Brent Staples, and now he's a columnist for the New York Times. But he says this as he's walking through Hyde Park, and he's an African-American man. I became an expert in the language of fear. Couples locked arms, and notice this phenomenon of microaggression as Sheila was describing it, right? Couples locked arms or reached for each other's hand when they saw me. Some crossed to the other side of the street. People who were carrying on conversations went mute and stared straight ahead, as though avoiding my eyes would save them. I'd been a fool. I'd been walking the streets grinning good evening at people who were frightened to death of me. I did violence to them by just being. Imagine a person who feels this. How had I missed this? And what does he do? So he's trying to diminish the effects of the stereotype and prejudice. I tried to be innocuous, but didn't know how. I began to avoid people. I turned out of my way into side streets to spare them the sense that they were being stalked. Out of nervousness, I began to whistle and discovered I was good at it. My whistle was pure and sweet, and also in tune. On the street at night, I whistled popular tunes from the Beatles and Vivaldi's Four Seasons. The tension drained from the people's bodies when they heard me. A few even smiled as they passed me in the dark. So what Brent Staples was doing, well, he was disengaging this stereotype, right? Now the question is this, should he have to do this? And the answer is no. He was subjected to a form of what we now are defining as micro-invalidation or micro-insult. So should he be subjected? No. And that is why I think it's on us to educate ourselves about stereotype threat, about implicit attitudes. And that's what we're doing right now. That's amazing that we are doing it right now. How are we doing it? Well, I actually have a little project for you. And the project is to just ask you to answer the following questions by writing yes or no. And you can write or you can say it in your mind. And I'm going to let you look at them for a minute and answer, yes, no to them. So I'm going to assume that you did. This is where I wish we had more time, to actually get a glimpse of how you answered and all of that. But I'm going to ask you to reflect on how you answered in light of what I'm saying right now. Do you believe that people can have negative implicit associations even toward their in-group? So I'm going to ask you to think about how many answers of no you have to these questions. Do you have any answers of no? And if you have even one or at least one no response, then you and me, might be in the same category, right? Where we basically can have negative implicit associations or believe that people can have them toward their own group. Sometimes we don't believe it. Scientific evidence is suggesting that the answers to all of these questions are yes. But implicitness is so insidious that we don't realize it. To give you an example that's in a way heartbreaking, right? Maybe some of you are familiar with the doll test studies. Kenneth and Mamie Clark in the 1930s and 1940s, placed a white doll and a black doll in front of black kids and asked them to say which one is nice, which one is beautiful, which one would they choose, which one looked more like them. And you see in these heartbreaking pictures that both the girl and the boy are choosing white dolls. They also identify with the white dolls. They say that the white dolls are nicer. But to identify with them and to think that whiteness is, niceness. And ABC News actually did a little repeat of that when Barack Obama was president. And the good news is that this identification doesn't happen to that extent. But in that particular video, you can still see black girls saying, I identify with the black girl, but I'm not mean. And that's heartbreaking too, right? There's this stereotype, this prejudice that even black girls have against themselves. That's how insidious this particular phenomenon is, right? So now I want to spend a few minutes talking about a couple of sources of prejudice and consequences of it, and definitely ways to deal with it. The first type of source of prejudice is one that's cognitive, comes from the mind. It's the idea of social categorization. Gordon Allport, in his seminal book, The Nature of Prejudice, almost 70 years ago that he wrote it, right, says that the human mind must think in categories, that it is something that happens intrinsically. The author of our textbook, David Meyer, says that stereotypes are springing less from malice of the heart than from machinery of the mind. As Sheila was saying, we immediately categorize on the basis of race. That's the first thing that comes to mind. And that's why we cannot be colorblind. We do it. So now that we do it, we need to also be aware of what comes after it, right? The stereotyping. So social categorization, because it's stereotyping, it's a fast way, it's a heuristic, a fast way of solving dilemmas when we are in a rush and so on. It's spontaneous. And it's not prejudice, but it can be a foundation for prejudice. Why? Because we perceive more differences in people who are from the out group, people who aren't like us. Also, we perceive people who are in a different group as the same. That's called the out group homogeneity effect. They all look the same to me, and we have this this happening, for instance, in examples such as the Swiss. If I were to ask you, what do you know about the Swiss? I know students of mine from the past have talked about clocks, chocolate, neutrality, but the Swiss are very different. They actually speak 4 languages. They have 4 official languages in Switzerland. It's not a big country, and they are different. Nevertheless, we perceive them as the same. Latinos, the same thing, whether people are coming from Mexico, Puerto Rico, or from other parts, it doesn't matter. Everybody's called Latinos, right? So we put everybody in that category and everybody is the same. And then we have this idea, and then it's a reality, not just an idea, that we find it easier to distinguish between people who belong to our race. And this is called the own race bias, and it happens to everyone. I want to show you this image where in this particular study by Devine and Malpass, it's a classic. What you are going to notice is that in terms of recognition accuracy, white subjects had a harder time distinguishing people, with black faces than white faces, the race in the photos. However, black subjects showed the opposite, right? They had an easier time recognizing people who are Black than people who are white. And the same thing happens, you know, with races, trying to recognize people of other races and be accurate about it, right? So this is true for every race. It's not true just for whites or just for Blacks. So the second explanation, the second cause or source of prejudice comes from how we define our identity. The first one, remember, was categorization. The first one is social identity theory. And categorization feeds into social identity theory. It's a theory that was proposed by Turner and Tashfeld in the 80s and then updated in the 2000s. And when you think about social identity, in chapter 2, we discussed about identity as a whole, personal identity, right? Now, the social element is the we aspect of the self, our belonging to a certain group and defining ourselves and gaining, you know, gaining self-esteem from that particular group. We identify, for instance, with the Cubs when they win, and we say, we won, right? The we aspect of the self. However, when they lose, we disengage and we say, they lost. So immediately, once we create an in-group, our group, there's the element of the out-group being formed as well. And as a result of that, we create biases, and it's automatic, and we don't control them. Remember, we talk about the implicit element, right? Group identifications can promote an in-group bias, right? We have this us versus them mentality. We exaggerate differences between the in-group and the out-group. We ascribe human emotions to only people who belong to our group, and we favor people who belong to our group. There is, but I think I'm going to show you another video, but there's a sneakers ad that was designed for the Middle East a few years ago. And it's absurd in the fact that it takes and it puts together in a fight, like the people, you know how you're crossing the street and there's the green light and then there's the red light. So there's these little people that are showing you to cross when it's green and to stop when it's red. So in this sneakers, which is a chocolate ad, they make this antagonistic, and there's like a fight between the red and the green. So even with abstract categories, if you will, or absurd or random categories, this us versus them mentality can be formed. And the social identity leads to threat and to consequences of prejudice. Why? Because of what Claude Steele in this book, this is an amazing book, by the way, that I recommend it to everyone. And it's the Whistling Vivaldi book. He talks about identity contingencies, and he defines them as the things you have to deal with in a situation because you have a given social identity. You're either young or you're old, you're white, you're Black, you're Latino, you're either female or male, you're conservative or you're liberal, you're a cancer patient, or you're a person who suffers from depression. All of these identity contingencies are offering you certain cues that then make you feel threatened in certain circumstances. And how is this threat working? It's working as a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? We're talking about consequences. That all these expectations that are embedded in stereotypes, they can guide behaviors. Kind of like what happened with the gentleman who decided to whistle Vivaldi. Because there were people on the street who had expectations that Black men were violent. They did something. They crossed the street, they put their hands on their purses. And then the person who was stereotyped had to react in a certain way. And there are all kinds of studies that talk about that. One, for instance, that I have summarized in a schematic over here talks about white interviewers interviewing Black and white job candidates. And because of this expectation that Black male job candidates would underperform, you know, there's a stereotype and prejudice associated with Black people having lower scores on intelligence tests, right? So that's a stereotype and prejudice that's established. And Claude Steele has tens of studies published on it. And then that leads to an increased distance. The person, the interviewer, stands further away, conducts shorter interviews, and makes errors in speech. As a result of that, the Black person obviously is becoming uncomfortable and then is perceived as not competent. Very weird how this works, but that's how the self-fulfilling prophecy works. And then the second and last consequence, before we talk about remedies, and I turn it on to Sheila, I want to preface it by sharing a quote by Claude Steele. And that fits into microaggression tremendously, because what microaggression has to do with and why it impacts and threatens people so much is the uncertainty of it, the cumulative effect of uncertainty. You never know if you've been slighted, if that was intentional or not. So he has this quote in the book, and he says, I remember once noticing my hands in the middle of a seminar. What did their darkness mean? Nothing? Everything? So it's the uncertainty that's so hard to deal with. And that is, in a way, a bridge, between how we understand microaggressions. And the research on microaggressions up to this point has been a lot on the qualitative side, but it feeds into very similar trends with stereotype threat, which has been studied for very many years in a quantitative way as well. So the stereotype threat leads from the idea of identity threat, right? There's these identity contingencies that are coming in and influencing people, right? The cues present in the air that signal possibly threatening stuff. Like, for instance, you're the only woman on the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor. She was followed everywhere. The moment she had somebody else, Justice Ginsburg, who was a woman, that identity threat subsided. Being Claude Steele, the only Black African-American graduate student in his program at Ohio State University. And he felt then, he felt this threat of being stereotyped. And he is very careful to note, even if he wasn't, even if there was no prejudice present, that uncertainty, am I going to be stereotyped according to the stereotype of the race that I belong to, according to this identity contingency, or am I not? So that uncertainty can play tricks on the mind. How? There's a diminished mental and physical stamina. So when, for instance, African Americans are stereotyped that they don't do good on intelligence tests, and they are reminded of their race, they don't do good on the test. But when they are presented with a test and being told, hey, this is actually a puzzle, there's no difference between whites and blacks on achievement. Isn't that amazing? Right? So the self-confirming fear of being evaluated based on the negative stereotype, it's very powerful. Why do we have this diminished mental and physical stamina? We are stressed, and the brain under stress does not work very well. We self-monitor all the time. Am I making a mistake? Right? There's little capacity left for what you actually have to do. And trying to suppress all of this all the time, that interferes with your working memory. And yes, can lead to diminished performance. For a majority groups, we have meta-stereotypes. There's the stereotype of whites as racist. And the white person actually is aware of being stereotyped white as racist. And then might think in any interaction with a Black person, I might be perceived as racist. So what happens now, and why we have this sort of aversive racism, is that white people say, rather than me being judged, I will not interact. And that, my friends, is why most diversity training programs, according to research, Claude Steele says only 8 out of the 24 that he looked at worked. Most of them don't work. Why don't they work? Because they put people on the defensive. And when a person thinks that they are going to be judged, that's not going to allow for mental capacity to process the information. And that's called aversive racism. And it leads to more discrimination practices in hiring in the workplace. Very weird, but this is how it happens, right? This is a complex phenomenon. So I want to just share with you a little clip. It's couple of minutes from a class divided, where this teacher, amazing teacher in Iowa, divides the class according to eye color, creates a microcosm of society. They start discriminating against each other in horrid ways. But what happens to their performance on some cards, some spelling cards, it's what I actually wanna show you, and it's 2 minutes. And then I'm gonna get close to, I'm gonna hand it over to Sheila in a second to talk about ways to fix this. So let me just find the minute, it's 12:39. Find the minute where you see what happens to their performance when they are stereotyped.
You want to be timed this morning?
Yeah.
They are timed.
I use Orton Gillingham Phonics. We use the card pack. And the children, the brown-eyed children, were in the low class the first day, and it took them 5.5 minutes to get through the card pack. The second day, it took them 2.5 minutes. The only thing that had changed was the fact that now they were superior people.
I thought we were going to get in the
You went faster than I've ever had anyone go through the card pack. Why couldn't you get them yesterday?
We had those collars on.
You think the collars kept you?
Just keep thinking about those collars.
Oh.
And my eyes kept getting rolling around.
Oh, and you couldn't think as well with the collars on. 4 minutes and 18 seconds.
I know we weren't going to make it.
How long did it take you yesterday?
3 minutes.
3 minutes. How long did it take you today?
4 minutes and 18 seconds.
What happened?
Went down.
Why? What were you thinking of?
This.
I hate today.
How do you do? I hate too.
Because I'm blue-eyed.
See, I am too.
There's nothing, it's not funny, it's not fun, it's not pleasant. This is a filthy, nasty word called discrimination. We're treating people a certain way because they are different from the rest of us. Is that fair?
No.
Nothing fair about it. We didn't say this was going to be a fair day, did we?
No.
And it isn't. It's a horrid day. Okay, you ready? What?
All right, so this was in a microcosm of society with arbitrary distinctions based on eye color that took place over a day, and notice how their performance was affected. But what do you think happens when this is day after day after day after day? What do you think happens? So we need to be mindful of all of these, and we have solutions. There are solutions. Now, this is a messy problem, as Martin Luther King said. It's a messy problem with all kinds of chaos, but there are elements of hope. And Sheila's gonna take it over and talk about it. But Sheila, if it's okay, I'm gonna share the screen and then you talk, and then I'm gonna move on to mine. All right.
Okay, so thank you very much, Magdalena. It is really, we can do something about it. We can be a part of the solution. So I was just thinking, like, if there are family members who have certain stereotypes, it is always nice to kind of ask them, you know, why do they harbor such animosity towards the group in a very polite manner? Did they have a bad experience? I mean, that could be the basis for this. So were they a target of hatred? Was there some issue? How did they feel about that situation? So kind of engage in a very respectful manner. Secondly, be mindful of the language that you use. So if somebody says, you know, if you catch yourself saying, Latinos always are like this, or all whites are racist, or something like that, that is a red flag. So be aware of your own biases and be careful when you use stereotypical language. And racism is not funny. So if somebody makes racist jokes, please let your friends know that it is not appropriate. And be introspective. And like Dr. Park was just mentioning about this, about the IAT, that is a good way to start. You know, be aware of your own unconscious bias. So you may be experiencing peer pressure at certain points of time. So think about the way you acted in certain situations, question yourself why you did it. Be a good citizen, vote for people who are not racially divisive and do not bring race as a central problem. And also step out of your comfort zone. Try to expose yourself to people of different racial backgrounds, go to different ethnic festivals, uh, listen to different kinds of music. So these are some of the suggestions that I have, Magdalena.
Yes, I think those are wonderful, and they are echoed by the research that I have looked at. And talking about motivation awareness, internal motivation. Sometimes if we feel guilty, we do good, and that's okay. Intergroup interaction allows us to realize that problems we have, for instance, for university students, if we're Black and we notice these problems, but then we notice that white students have these problems too. You know, there's this universal bonding. Race becomes less salient, and that is good that we don't feel threatened all that much, right? Conversation looked at as a learning opportunity. We can make mistakes. Carol Dweck with the growth mindset. We can make mistakes and it's okay. We look at learning and growing. We have learning goals for interaction. Minimize identity contingencies, like Sheila was saying, but I want in the last minute or so, I also want to focus on helping the people who are on the receiving end of microaggressions or of prejudice. What can you do in order to not feel like a victim, in order to overcome stereotype threat and the consequences of it, in order to not allow identity contingencies to rule your life? What can you do? I think this is very important. You have more power than you think. And there's research that shows us that we can have a resilient, I'm absolutely passionate about resilience and strength, and we can develop a resilient identity. And notice that how you think of something can transform its effect on you. And this is true of stress everywhere. If we look at stress as a threat, stereotype threat, identity threat, then we form a narrative in our minds. And this is all from Claude Steele, by the way, this idea of the narrative. What narrative are we telling ourselves? What's our life story? Are we going to be always vigilant to threat? Are we sensitive to cues about whether we fit in or not? Well, we are, and sometimes we can't do this. But if we look at stress as a challenge, then we can form safety in our identity. And we can create these narratives. And he mentions them, and I think that's so empowering. A narrative of trust through relationships, which allows us to focus them. We don't feel threatened anymore. We don't feel stressed anymore. We can focus on the task at hand. Narrative of hope and belonging. Where you are, you belong. Narrative of intelligence as not fixed, but something that grows, and you can do something about it to beat stereotypes. And finally, remember something. Remember something, that what is the source of your stress? Generally, is stressing you because you care about it. And that's also a source of meaning for you in your life. So think about the values that you have. And research is showing that when we think about the values that we have, about our character, and why that matters to us, that influences our well-being and our success. So my invitation to you as we close and before we take your question is to write this narrative of personal adequacy. Write this narrative of victory and hope in your life. Wherever you are, you know, today we talked about race. Next time we'll talk about gender and other identities that we have, other identity contingencies. But there is hope, and that is what I would like, and Sheila would like to, I think together, just want to close on this hopeful note and to ask you if you have questions for us. We have a few minutes for questions, and we would be, we are open and hopeful that you have a few for us. You can write them in chat if you'd like, or simply unmute yourself and ask them.
I was just going to say what I really, can you hear me right now?
Yes.
Okay, good. What I really enjoyed from this was just, and And it kind of touched on the resilience too, but just the power of perception and how your perception of an event can make something a positive or a negative, and how you can kind of learn to spin it a little bit. I love that thought process. I could go down a wormhole with that.
And regardless of our identity, when we look at stress and all of these challenges that come our way, when we see them as a challenge, that's an opportunity for us to do something. When we feel threatened, then we kind of shrink down, regardless of the situation of where we are in life or the identity that is salient at that point. Thank you, Carrie. That's a wonderful thought. You know, I would like to acknowledge the fact, one of you, and think of questions, but again, one of you said, you know, I feel like whites are attacked. And I think that it's a feeling that we need to acknowledge, because that is the reason why research is showing us. If you listen to Mazarine Banerjee, and I'm going to share with you a Padlet that I made with all kinds of resources, and I'm going to share it in chat as soon as I'm done. But that's what Mazarine Banerjee has, a 3-minute clip over there telling us why it doesn't work when we do these diversity trainings, and we try to tell people, you're not going to be judged, everything is fine. Actually, we're priming them with judgment, and people feel like they are going to be judged. It's paradoxical, but this is what happens. This is how our mind is thinking. That is why these programs, they don't work. There's something else that needs to be done. And it's not okay. And we certainly today did not want to attack anyone, because more than ever, we are aware of this, right? But also it's important to be aware of this implicit side, that we are so complex. And as Martin Luther King Jr. says, it's chaotic. We're trying to make sense and order of all of this research and these nuances. But there's this implicit element that we aren't aware of. And it's worthwhile. I'm white. For me, it is worthwhile to know. I'm also an immigrant, and I'm aware of some of this stuff. You speak good English, or you speak with an accent. This has been my life experience, but that's okay, because I see it as a challenge to be better in everything that I do, to show that I am capable, right? So it depends on how we look at it. Definitely, this was not meant as an attack, just as a raising of awareness. And there's Claude Steele calls in this book, calls this difficulty to talk about this. He says it's the great American discomfort. We don't like talking about stuff that doesn't make us feel comfy. But you know what? We need to, because otherwise we don't make progress. And sometimes it hurts. It doesn't make us feel good, but that's okay, because it makes us think and learn.
I want to add to that, Magdalena, and that is the whole idea, right? I mean, when you have prejudice that even unconscious bias, which we have been talking about, it's not related to you as an individual person. It's just simply because we are part of the system, and that's what sociologists say. It's a part of the system. You're part of the society. We cannot escape it, right? We are not living in a vacuum. So we are bombarded with these messages through the media, through our institutions. When we discuss this with our peer pressure, or various other sources, right? So it's not that. And that's what we have to be aware of it. And it is not to judge anybody. Like I mentioned just now, that be aware that when you say everybody who belongs to a particular racial category is having a particular trait, I mean, we are taking away what this individual actually is and stands for. So it's applicable to whites, it's applicable to people of color as well.
And I just sent you this Padlet form with all kinds of links to all kinds of sources. I sent it to you in chat. So if you want to copy it and save it, my students, you have it in Canvas. It's another resource for exploring more. We're very grateful, Sheila and I, for today. If you have any other questions, don't hesitate to email us and let us know. Let's engage in these discussions. Let's engage in them. That's the only way that we grow. Melissa, thank you so much for organizing this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Closing, anything that you want to say as we are wrapping up?
No, thank you so much, Magda and Sheila, for doing this presentation. It was really great. We learned a lot, and thank you for the students who participated as well. Please don't forget to sign up for the attendance sheet and be on the lookout for our last success workshop, which will be happening on April 14th. We'll be talking about imposter syndrome. So if you don't know what that is, or maybe you think that you deal with something like this, please make sure you come. It will also be available via Zoom. Okay. Thank you, y'all.
Yes, thank you everyone, because you made it being possible, right? By participating. Bye.